Well, thank you for coming back for part two of our UI UX design with Figma series, and also thank you for braving the rain. I thankfully got in before it started real bad, and then I looked out the window and it was downpouring. So thank you for coming. Yeah, cool. As a reminder of where we are at in our roadmap here. So last week we did those intro and design basic stuff. So changing colors and fonts and putting some stuff in layouts. And then today we're going to be doing some more what we're calling intermediate design techniques. This is a combination of things that are a little bit more advanced than what we did last week, and also some things that could have maybe been included in last week, but we just ran out of time. And I'll show you what all of this will be and what we're building today. And then next week, same day of the week, same time, we're doing the animation and prototyping so that it comes to life. Cool. So yeah, let's just jump right in. So what are we doing today? So we're going to build kind of three parts of this design. So the first one is we're going to be building a like light and dark theme icons kind of switcher. We're not going to actually make them switch, but we're going to be using some different techniques for how do you create symbols and icons in Figma, especially if there's something in that one icon plugin that I showed you last week that doesn't fit what you're looking for. This is how you can create your own. We'll also build upon those kind of project card ideas that we were doing last week, but making them a little bit more reusable and portable and moving them around so that you don't have to create this every single time that you make something. And this techniques we're going to be using for that apply to pretty much everything in Figma that you want to make reusable. And then lastly, we'll be doing a little bit of this responsive design using some auto layout constraints. This basically is like if you design something to look good on desktop, how do you set it up in Figma so that as you like decrease the width so that it's more of like a phone size, that it kind of automatically kind of resizes to fit that. We'll be going some basics of that, but it can get a little bit complicated. All right. So I have a link up here. This is going to be our starting file for today. So it's bit.ly/s25 Figma 2. So if you type that into whatever browser you're using Figma with, you should see a community file that I published. It should have that like kind of flyer design as its thumbnail. So I'll go there right now. So bit.ly/s25 Figma 2, and it should pop up like this. And then you just click open in Figma. And what this does is it takes that community file that I published and just duplicates it. And so now you can edit stuff. Don't worry, you won't mess up my file. You get to do everything uniquely on your own. And I've set up a bunch of stuff in here, like the text styles and the color styles and the grids and stuff that we did last week as well. All right. So we're going to get started with our first kind of intermediate design thing, and that's creating our sun and our moon icons to have this kind of light dark theme switcher. So I'm going to click on the home frame up here, and I'm going to switch my grid to on using that eye icon, just so I can easily set up where my icon is going to be. I'm going to Command plus and use the space bar and click and move to get over to where I'm going to design it, which is going to be right up here in our kind of menu. I'm kind of thinking this kind of block right by here. All right. So the thing with Figma, when you're designing your own icons, is you probably want to start with some basic shapes, ideally, and then get yourself there and edit those shapes. You can, if you want to, use like the pen tool, which we did a little bit with that wireframing thing we did last week, creating those lines. You can create things with like curves and start doing stuff like this. I find this really hard to get used to, if I'm being honest. So I try to simplify it and just use shapes and edit existing shapes. Okay, cool. If you just joined, that link on the whiteboard takes you to our starting file that you can copy. So let's start off by creating our sun icon. So under our shape tools, if you open up that group and click the ellipse, you can also press O on your keyboard. So we used shapes before where we clicked and dragged to create the size. A really kind of fancy trick is if you just click, it'll create a perfect 100 by 100 circle. Or if you were using the rectangle, it would create a perfect 100 by 100 rectangle. And that's just using that tool and then just clicking. So now resize your circle to kind of fit into whatever grid bounds that you want to do. I'm gonna click and hold on this top right, hold down Shift on my keyboard and then move it down. This just basically makes sure that you are keeping things symmetrical. If you don't have that Shift, you can kind of do whatever you want. But with Shift, it makes that aspect ratio of the width and height locked as you're resizing. So I'm just going to resize it to be within there. So 50 by 50 is pretty good. Now, like with our rectangle, there is this little circle icon within our shape right here. With the rectangle, it was for rounded corners. So just basically making them not sharp and then making them rounded. With the circle, it's a little bit different. And this is the first thing that we're going to learn is this arc tool. So if you click on the arc tool, which is that circle, and you start moving it, you can create this cut within your circle. So the first value right there is called the sweep. And this is just basically how much gap there is in your shape, basically. So you can just place it wherever. This circle in the middle is your ratio. And this creates a cut in the middle. As you look at this, you might see, oh, that kind of looks like a data chart graph. So if you wanted to create something like that to put in, you can do it like this. Then you also have this circle in that one. This is called the start. And this just basically rotates it. And so you can move that around so that it maybe starts like this or starts up here at the top or something like so. All right. All of these settings are also over here in this appearance one. And so as you change them, you'll notice those numbers change as well. And so if you figure out like a specific number that works well for what you're trying to do, you can just input them in right here. So for the ratio, which is this last one over here, this percentage, I'm going to put in 85. And that just, we're going to make this kind of ring around our sun, basically. Then here in the middle for the sweep, I'm going to move this back to 100. And when I do that, I get this perfect ring that is cut out. This start one isn't going to matter at all because we have a perfectly circular circle, and it's just kind of rotating and there's always stuff in the same position, basically. Cool. Any questions about the arc tool? Cool. So we're going to create a duplicate of this for our moon icon. Does anyone remember the little keyboard shortcut trick I taught? Yes.
Hold down option.
Yes. So hold down Option if you're on Mac, Alt if you're on Windows, and then click and drag to move it over. And then you just create that duplicate. Cool. So let's create the sun part of our sun icon. So basically the Envision is like a super simple, almost like kids drawing. So we keep it simple, where it's like a circle in the middle and then little triangles around it to show that it's a sun. So we're going to create a new circle in this middle. So make sure you have your ellipse tool selected either by clicking on it down here in the toolbar or clicking O on your keyboard. I'm going to click again to just create that perfect circle there. And then I'm going to hold down Shift and click and drag so that it's about 25, I think works well for this. Once you have both the smaller 25 by 25 circle and this ring, you could easily try to drag and move and position this to be where you want it to be. I'm going to make sure that it's perfect by clicking on my smaller circle, holding down Shift and clicking on my ring, and then using these position tools up here under position. So this one right here is that align horizontal centers. And then this one right here is that align vertical centers. And by clicking both of those, it just makes sure that they're perfectly centered in every which way possible. As a reminder, that's this middle one here, and then the middle one over here as well. And then I'm just going to click and drag to move it back into my little area. Cool. Any questions so far? Yeah, so select both of them. So select your circle and then hold down Shift and select the ring, and then use the align horizontal centers tool or option and the align vertical centers, which are both of these middle options here in this position. All right. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more so it's a little bit easier to see. And we're going to need to create about 8 triangles around here is what I did for my design. Now we haven't done triangles yet, but they're used with this polygon tool. So if you open up your shape tools options, we have polygon. It does not have a keyboard shortcut. So you can just click on polygon right there. And I'm actually going to zoom out. I'm going to click right here and you'll notice it creates our 100 tall by 100 wide triangle. But there's, for some reason in Figma, there's this huge gap at the bottom, always. I don't know why they add this personally. It makes it a little bit weird. I found a trick actually as I was preparing this file of how to get rid of this. So if you double click into your triangle as if you're going to edit it, just click and drag and move it around a little bit and then click outside of it. It like redoes the box for you to make it actually work. Yeah, easier to position when it's actually in line. So weird little trick with that. Now I'm going to change my width and my height over here to 5 by 5. I get this really small triangle that I can place with my sun icon. All right. Now, as I zoom in, you might have to zoom in a little bit for your triangle. I maybe want to have this where these are rounded. And so you can do that with the same tools, which are down here in the appearance. So this is that same corner radius, and you'll notice because our triangle is so small, even like a thing of 1 is going to make it super rounded. And so I'm just going to put in here 0.5, and this creates kind of like a cool, still rounded triangle that still looks like a triangle. Okay, so now we got to create the other 7, but we're going to make them in some kind of shortcut way so we don't have to keep doing this. So I'm going to hold down Alt or Option on my keyboard, click and drag to move it down in position down here, and let go. Now, Figma has some quick little flip tools so that you don't have to rotate and manually get it. You have them over here under this little grid section. So we have flip horizontal, which is going to be your left and right, and then your flip vertical, which is up and down. So if you do flip vertical, you'll get your upside down triangle. And that's this one over here. So now I'm just going to select all of these again and making sure that they are aligned center-wise within each other and just position my triangles manually so that they look kind of halfway in between my sun and my ring. So now that we have these two, it actually makes it pretty easy to like duplicate them and rotate them. So if you have your top triangle selected and you hold down Shift and you click down on this bottom triangle, we've been doing this Alt or Option click and drag, but I'm actually just going to do Command C, Command V to paste, or Control C, Control V if you're on Windows. It pastes it in the same exact position as where your elements were before, which we actually want in this scenario. So right by our flip tools over here, we also have this rotate 90 degrees tool. And if you click on that, it just perfectly flips them and rotates them so that we have our side. You might have to do some manual adjustment of where they are, but then you should get these kind of top down, left and right triangles. With those two still selected, hold down Shift and select the other two and do your Command C, Command V, Control C, Control V to create duplicates of them again. Now this time, none of those flip or rotation tools are really going to help us here. And so what you want to do is with any object or stuff, if you want to rotate it, if you just hover on the outside of the corner of the box, you can do any corner. You'll see this little bend arrow tool. So you can just click and drag to rotate it. And so I'm just going to make it so that it's kind of as best as I can, like so. Remember to get there, it's hovering over the edge of that box. So now you'll notice that we have our sun icon right here that is made up of all of these different, oh, don't do that, all of these different layers. And you can accidentally change something about these layers by moving them. You could try to group them all into like your one icon, but then all of those elements are still editable and stuff. So what I like to do when I've laid out something pretty well, I'm not going to make changes to these triangles, these rings, the circle. You can change color, don't worry, but just shape wise, I like to select them all over in our layers panel. Make sure that you don't have anything else selected so you don't accidentally include something. If you right click, you'll get our options menu, and we have this flatten option. What this basically does is it takes all of those layers that we've selected and squishes them down into one layer. So when I click that, you'll notice I don't have all of those polygon things anymore. I have one called vector. And so basically now, as I click on my sun icon, it's the whole icon. It's not just the circle. It's not just the triangle that I'm clicking on. You can do still those like shape editing options that we've played around with slightly before. Double click into somewhere, you can see all of those points that makes up that shape. So you still can make some edits. So don't be afraid about flattening something. You can also Command Control Z to undo if you accidentally did it. But ideally, before you're flattening, it's in a good place. Cool. So I'm going to double click where it says vector over here and just rename it sun icon just so I know what it is. All right. Any questions about what we've done before we play around with some color stuff? No? Cool. So before we do color, again, with our grid, we have that red, which is going to impact what our color looks like. So I'm going to go back, click on home, and then undo that eye icon on our grid. So I clicked up here, and then went down here and changed my eye icon just so I don't see that grid as I'm trying to work with some color stuff. I can go back to my sun icon. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see it better. So we played around with pretty much only flat colors before, right? So you would pick a rectangle, you would set it to be purple. You would pick a text layer, you would set it to be black. But now we're going to play around with some gradients. Have any of you used gradients in like other design programs before? Yeah. Cool. So to add a gradient, click on your icon, and right where it says fill, we have our color box option right here. So if you click on there, this is where you would normally pick your one color, but you can also switch over to a gradient by using this button right here. So underneath where it says custom, that first one is individual color, your solid color, and then you have gradient. A gradient is simply two or more colors put in some arrangement, and it's blended between them. So Figma has 4 gradient options. The first one being what the default is, which is linear, and I'll scroll out so you see it a little bit. This is just basically a line. And you put colors on this line, and it determines where they're blended. You can, if you want to see, for example, maybe more of this kind of grayish color and less of this darkish gray, you can click on the end and then move it down to increase the distance of your gradient, even if it's beyond your shape. And that just basically blends more of it over a longer distance. You can also rotate it around. So if you want like light coming at it from an angle or something like that, that's how you do that. To change the color, you can just click on the stops over here and just change your color right there. So if I didn't want this dark or this light color, I just click there and I can change, 1 second, click there, and I can just change it. And you can also input that color code down there as well. So now with these other options, we have radial, which is basically a circle. So one color on the center, and then other colors on the outside on all edges. We have angular, which is a pretty funky one, in my opinion, because it always has this sharp edge right here. And you can like move stuff around. You can play around with it to see how it kind of looks, but takes some getting used to. And then we have our diamond, which is the same thing as our radial, which is that one color in the center and then more colors on the outsides. But instead of it being a circular shape, it's a diamond. And so you can kind of see that if I move this in. So for this one, it's a sun. I'm going to do it as our circular, our radial. And let's see what colors I chose. So for this first color, at this 0, you can pick whatever color you want to play around with. The one that I chose was FF7637. All right. And then our outside color, I picked FFEE71. And so it's more of this yellow. Now, the way that I've positioned this, it looks a little funky, obviously. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to move this in. I'm going to increase the size of my circle by using this kind of toggle. So it's not like this, it's more kind of spread out. Maybe I want to see a little bit like at an angle-ish. So just play around with a little bit of your controls to get the sun to be what you want it to be. All right. Any questions about gradients? So we're gonna move on from our sun icon and go to our moon icon over here. And so my idea for this is that we're gonna make a moon shaped like a crescent moon and then maybe some little stars. But with the crescent moon, if we were to try to do our ellipse tool, our circle, and we play around with our arc and our thing, we're gonna get some weird little things. It gets a little bit difficult. So there's a different way to work with shapes that I find is better for this sort of project. So the first thing that we're gonna do is create a new circle. So use your ellipse tool, O on your keyboard, and you can click. And again, these ones I want to be 25 pixels by 25 pixels, like our circle for our sun. If you don't want to move and resize this and you already know the number, over here under layout, there's this lock aspect ratio button. And basically what that does is it says if you have a certain amount of width with its ratio against your height, it's always going to be that same ratio. So right now it's 1 to 1, right? So 1 pixel width to 1 pixel height. These numbers are equal. So if I click this, I'll see that these two values are linked a little bit. It's a little hard to see, but if you squint a little bit. And then in my width, I'm just going to put 25 and enter. And then it automatically applies that setting to our height as well. So now for this technique, we need to have a second circle that is the same size. So I'm just going to hold down Alt or Option on my keyboard and click and drag, and so that they're overlapped a little bit. Now with these two colors, it's the same color, so this is going to be a little hard to see. So I'm going to change the colors on these circles. Feel free to follow along if you want. You don't need to though. I'm going to change this bottom circle, the first one we created on the left. It's the one that's underneath on the layers over here. I'm going to change that to a blue color. And this is just for demonstration purposes. The one on the top, so top here on over here, it's over on my right. I'm going to change this to a red, just so we can kind of clearly see which one's underneath the other, and so that you can see what happens when we do all of these tools. So does everyone have two circles that overlap in some way? Cool. Select them both. And over here, you'll notice that we see two selected, and we have this 3-dot menu up here. So if you click on that, this is our More Actions menu. And we're going to talk a little bit about these right here. So these are what are called Booleans, which is some fancy term. And I understand it more in programming lingo. I don't know why they used it in this design one, but basically it's looking at these two shapes and we're going to create a new shape based on these two, is basically what it means. So union selection, if you click that one, we'll take both of your shapes and combine them into one using their outlines. So this one, I had a circle right here and a circle right here, and then it just combines them. So I get this kind of weird two-circle Venn diagram without the middle thing. I'm going to Command Z to undo that. Subtract selection, you can probably guess this is the one that we want, is going to take the bottom layer and then look at the top one and subtract whatever overlaps from the bottom one. So in this case, we had this part, this kind of like weird, that overlapping Venn diagram part, and it's going to subtract that from our bottom circle. I'm going to Command Z so I can show you the other ones. Intersect selection is going to look at where do they overlap and only keep the where they overlap. And I'm going to Command Z on that one. And exclude selection is the last one. This will look at where they overlap and keep everything else. So with this, I am going to go back to my subtract selection because that creates that crescent moon shape that we were looking for. Cool. Any questions about those Booleans? All good? Cool. So now we have our last little shape tool, which is our star. So with, before I do this, I forgot to mention with the polygons, we did this for triangles, but over here, when you use the polygon, there will be under appearance where it says 3. This is the number of sides for your shape. So if you wanted to create something with more, like a diamond, or I forget the shape names if I'm honest, or like this 5-sided shape or a 6-sided, you can just keep going and create something like that using the polygon tool. But we have our star tool, which is what we're going to use. So I'm going to click, and same thing kind of with this star tool as that polygon tool. It creates that extra space underneath. The double click within it to edit the shape, just kind of move it around and then click outside. And then you actually have the shape you're looking for. And I'm going to create these at 10 by 10 as my first one. And then I want to do my rounded borders again here, because that's kind of the vibe of this project. It's all rounded. So under my corner radius and appearance, 0.5 to make it where it's still a star, but it's just a little bit more rounded. Now, while in LA, we might only see one star out in the night sky, but ideally we would see more. So we're going to create some more. Just Alt Option, click and drag to do some extra stars. And I'm going to resize them just so it looks a little bit more dynamic. You can follow along if you would like to. So I'm going to click on a star, lock its aspect ratio, change 1 to 5. You'll notice that with a rounded corner, though, it looks really funky. So I'm just going to change that to like 0. Maybe 2.5. Now 0.25 looks good with 5. Do the same for this other one. Maybe like 7.5 is a good size, and 0.33 for my corners. They don't have to be perfect, just create some stars with different shapes and stuff like that. All right, and arrange and place these as you see fit. You might want to maybe not do that and just make a little icon that you like. I'm going to click on my moon icon because it's blue, and I'm just going to change it back to this default color. To do that pretty easily, you can just click on your color picker, then click on your eyedropper tool, and then just click anywhere in your design with that color, and it'll change to that color. All right, cool. So your little challenge / just practice with what we've done. Select all of the stuff in your moon icon, flatten them into one layer, that one vector layer, and apply some sort of gradient to it to make it colored how you would like it to be. I'll give you 2-3 minutes, and then I will show you how I did it. All right. Hopefully you remembered some of the stuff that we went through for this. If not, don't worry. I'm about to show it to you. So I'm going to click and drag to just select everything. You can also select them over in your layers panel. I'm going to right click and click flatten, and that just makes it into our one layer, our vector. I'm going to double click in here and rename it moon icon, just so I know what it is. I'm going to click over here in my fill color picker and switch it to gradient. Funnily enough, the radial one, the circular one, I think looks the best with this as well. So we're getting more practice with that. For the center, I chose this lighter kind of color. So FDEC9D. And then for this outer color, I chose this kind of darker bluish, so 040041. I wanted to see more of this yellow, so I played around with this by clicking and dragging this, but I also have the numbers that I wrote down. So I put this all the way over at 70%, so that moves it way down my gradient line. And then I slightly moved in this darker one, so I saw a little less of that glow on my ring, but I still liked the glow, so I did something like that. But whatever you did, I'm sure it looks beautiful. So I'll just leave that open if you want to copy it, but you can do whatever you want. Now, something that we haven't done with gradients yet, I'm not going to keep this so you don't have to follow along if you're following me one-to-one, but I just want to show you that it is a possibility, is adding additional stops to add more colors. So if I click on the plus icon, it's going to automatically add a new color in between my two. I could switch this, let's say, to my 0% to move it up, and then I can change my color here if I wanted to add like some additional kind of color and create some more dynamic gradients that have more than just two colors. You just add it with this plus icon by the stops. We're going to get into one of the ones that is slightly harder, and that's this concept of masking. And basically what masking is using shapes to edit only specific parts of other shapes or images or stuff like that. In Photoshop, it's used a lot if you're learning Photoshop or know some. you might create an adjustment layer and then adjust the layer mask to only apply the adjustment to a certain part of your image. It's kind of the same concept. It's a little bit more limited in Figma, but you can still do some cool stuff with it. So I'm going to zoom out by command minusing. You can also control minus, holding down the shift key, and we're going to work on our projects section. We're going to start our projects card. So I already have our project section set up as our group. And if you open it up, you'll see that I have these project 1 placeholder, 2 placeholder, 3, so on and so forth. So I'm going to select my project 1 placeholder. I'm assuming you know how to add a rectangle, so I already added it for you. But we're going to make some edits. So I'm going to change my rounded corners to 25. You can also click and drag in here to do this and see what works best for your stuff. For the fill, does anyone remember how you apply a color style to an element? Like a style that you saved before? Yes, perfect. There's 4 little squares. You click here, and then you can select one of those colors that I set up for us. I'm going to choose secondary. And then our idea for our project card is the same as last week, where we have this image at the top half. And then in the bottom half, we have the project name, the description, and a button that says view this project. So I'm going to go back and turn on our grid as we start doing layout stuff again. So clicking on home up here, you can also click on it in your layers panel, and then switching the eye icon. And we see that I've put it into this 4 column, 6 row. The idea is to have these 3 columns, or these 3 rows on top have our image, and then the 3 on the bottom have everything else. Now, if you remember from last week, you can round the corners of images and you can round them individually. So the top left, the top right corners, we could do that. I'm going to show you another trick for how to do that through masking. And I'll show you some other cool ways that you can use masking as well. So the first step is to create a half rounded rectangle up here at the top. So I'm going to click R on my keyboard to switch to my rectangle tool. You can also do that in your shape menu. I'm going to click just to create a 100 by 100. You can resize it to be exactly what it is in here. I already have the dimensions to make it easier for us. So that is going to be a width of 430 and a height of 190, and press enter. And then you can just move and position that to be up in that top half. So it is covering half of our card. Then I want to round just the top left, right, and top left and top right corners. As a reminder to do that, it's under appearance. You click on this little icon at the very right bottom of that, and then you have your individual corners. As we did our 25 pixels for our overall card, that's going to be what you want to do to match it for our top left and our top right. So I'm just going to put 25, 25, and enter. And now we have this shape that we're going to use for masking that has rounded at the top left and the top right. All good with that? Cool. Now we got to get an image. Feel free to use your own. I'm going to use one from our handy dandy plugin, Unsplash. So right click anywhere that's not your shapes. Go to plugins. If you're here last week, it might be under your recents. If it didn't show up there, you can also click manage plugins and search Unsplash, which is this one right here. You can also just click it to run it. So again, that's right clicking, manage plugins, or plugins, manage, search for Unsplash, and find an image that speaks to you that you want to use for this project, this fake project, essentially. I'm just going to look up floral. I'm going to use flowers as my theme for all my projects. My advice to you, just from playing around with this before, don't pick one with a white background, because our background of our frame is pretty white. So I'm going to pick this one, and I'm just going to click and drag to move it in. And you'll notice that it normally adds itself outside of a frame. So you'll want to click and drag to move it underneath your home frame. And this just makes sure that it's bound by the frame. It makes sure it's on the screen, it's on the page, and you don't get some wonky behavior. So now if you hover over, mine says rectangle 2, depending on how many rectangles you added, yours might be different. But you should see your rounded rectangle, the one that we created that only the top half is rounded. So if you position your image on top of that shape, select both, you probably will have to use the layer panel for this. So you should see a little blue outline around your shape, and your image should also be selected. Right click and click use as mask. What this does is it says, cool, you had this huge image, you have the smaller shape in the background, and basically it cuts out your image so that it's only using what's in that shape's size. It is still editable though. So in your mask group over here, I can click on my image icon or my image layer, which is this unsplash one, and I can still resize it to see different parts of my image in my mask. And I can move it around and do stuff like that. So I'm just going to resize it so I can see more of these flowers in a way that looks pretty good. Click and drag to move. Oh, that looks better. Something like that. I'm going to create a new page to show you some other ways that you can use masking that maybe are a little bit cooler than this. So I'm going to add new page. I'm just going to put masking here. You can follow along if you like, but I'm going to go a little fast through this. So I'm going to add a new desktop frame just to play around. I'm going to add my ellipse here, and I'm also going to use Unsplash to find a image. I'm going to do an image of a turtle this time and place it over there. Place it on my frame, resize it so it's a little bit better. If you need help resizing, you can always turn down your image opacity over here in the fill, and then it might be a little bit easier to see what's going to be included in your mask or not. So I'm just going to resize my image so it's kind of like so. Make sure you turn the opacity back up. I'm going to Control click, right click, use as mask. And now I kind of have this profile icon that you might see on like a streaming service or other things if you picked a turtle. That's one way you can create using masks. You can still click it and move around to make sure that you have that. For some reason, it did not create a mask group for me there. So I'm going to group them myself. Now, you can also use this if we go to like architecture, let's say, I'll use this image as an example this time. Masking can be a little difficult with this image because you have all of these kind of edges, right? And it might be hard to get a shape for your mask that shows only this building without getting all of this kind of extra fluff. Unfortunately, Figma doesn't have great image cropping tools, but a workaround is through the use of these masks. So if I right click and add a rectangle, I'm going to change the color to this kind of red. Maybe I'll darken it so you can see it a little bit better. And what you can do is you can edit an image if you want to add some more geometry. So essentially, I want to add something so I can get this cut right here. If I double click into my image, I see my slashing blue lines, which means I'm editing this rectangle shape. I can hover over this line and see this circle. When I click there, it adds what's called an anchor point, and then you can click that anchor point specifically and move that to make a different shape. And so if I just keep playing around with adding these different anchor points, this is probably not the best way to do this one, but I can start to create a shape that looks a little bit more like this building than it did before. And I'm just going to quickly and roughly make this just so I can show you what this looks like. That's good enough for now. I'll move it behind my image, and I can control, use as mask, and now I've kind of cut out that background using my custom shape. And then you can still move the image, so it's a little funky. But last thing with masking before we move on to something is you can also do this with text. So if I put the name Digital Lounge and I want this outside of the mask group, I'm just going to increase the size by a bunch to something like so. I'll make it black, let's say. I'm going to add my image, maybe like an abstract thing. This one's pretty cool. And I'm going to resize this around my text. So something like so. Select both, right click, use as mask. And now I get this cool text effect where the fill of my text is that image I was using before. All right, going back to our main project file. So I am going to add some text here that says like project one name. We're gonna add some placeholder text for description, and we're gonna create our button. So use the T on your keyboard or click this T icon, click anywhere and just type like project one name or whatever you want to fill it with. I'm going to click outside of that text box just to make sure I'm selecting everything and change it from H2 to H3, just because that's a better size for this. And I'm just going to position that in a way that looks okay. Adding the description text is the same to make things a little bit easier so we can cover other stuff. I'm just going to skip that. But let's make our button. Again, that's going to be your rectangle tool. I'm just going to make it span our 2 columns here. So it's about 201 by 50. I'm going to change our border radius, our corner radius over here to 25. So it's like a perfectly like pill shaped button. I'm going to switch this from this random color to this color style of accent. And then I'm going to add my text of like view project and just move that on top of our button. Now I'm going to select both of my rectangle shape and my text layer. I'm going to Command G to group them, Control G if you're on Windows. Double click in here, and I'm just going to say project button, and we have something that's working. Okay. Before we get to the kind of cool thing, I want to just go over the effects for a little bit. They're pretty simple. Also stroke is pretty simple, but we'll go through them all. So I'm going to select everything in our project card here. So that's my mask group, my title, project one name, and my group of project button. And I'm just going to group this into project one just to make things a little bit easier. Now I am going to go back and turn off my grid just so we can see things a little bit better. So I clicked on the home layer, and then down over here under layout grid, I just turned off the eyeball icon right by grid. All right, so let's talk about stroke and effects right now, which are our almost last two. There's export down here, which we'll go through next week. But stroke and effects are our last ones for design. If you click on the plus icon by stroke, this adds what's called a stroke is basically your border, right? So I can see it adds a border because I'm doing it on the group. It adds the border to everywhere on the group. We're not going to keep this. I just want to show you what stroke looks like. And so I can see my border around like my title, my text, my button right here. Pretty easy. You can change the color just like you can with all the other color stuff. So maybe I wanted something like so. You can change the opacity, what colored or transparent it is as well. Then you have right here, it says mixed for me, but you'll see these 3 different options. So you see center, inside, or outside. And this just basically determines where this border is added when you change its size. So put it on the outside for first, just so we can see this. And over here, we see this 1 icon. And this is basically just how many pixels wide our stroke is, our border. So if I click and drag on this icon up, you can also put numbers. It's going to increase the amount of border I have around. Now, because there's a bunch of things, it's a little finicky. It's a little weird. If you just applied it to like a regular rectangle, it's going to look a lot better. But basically, stroke is your border. Outside adds, as you increase the size, adds it on the outside. Inside is the exact opposite. The more you increase it, the more inside of it goes. And then center will take whatever number you have and divide it half for outside and half for inside, right? So if I have 5, that means that there's 2.5 pixels of border on the inside and 2.5 pixels on the outside, okay? So I'm just going to click this minus icon to get rid of it. I'm going to open up my project one group and go to my, oh, it's down here, my project one placeholder. So I'm going to just click and drag to move that up into our project one group. So it's down here in the project section. Project one placeholder is our rectangle. I'm just going to click and drag to move it up and into our project one group, but making sure it's underneath everything just so it's behind. So now let's talk about effects. So if I click on this add button by effects, I can add some different sort of design effects. There's only 4. So the first one, which we're going to play around with its settings, is drop shadow. And this just basically adds a shadow behind your element. So in this case, it's behind our rectangle. There's inner shadow, which is a little bit harder to see right now. But this basically, if I zoom in a little bit, you might see it right here. It has the shadow on the inside of your element. There is also layer blur, which this is basically whatever layer you're applying this to gets blurred. And there's also background blur, which is a little bit tricky to set up, but it's basically the opposite, where the stuff behind it gets blurred out. Okay, so let's go back to drop shadow. Drop shadows are used pretty commonly, especially to show that anything is like clickable. It creates this illusion of depth in a design because our digital design is basically all flat. And even though we can layer things so that things are in front of or behind things, they actually just aren't, right? If you want to create this illusion of depth, like a button that is maybe clickable or something is kind of like off the page a little bit, you would use something like a drop shadow. So I've applied my drop shadow effect and it creates this default. But if I click on this icon right here, I can change my drop shadow settings. So position is in your X and your Y. Your X, the further you increase it, the further to the right it's going to go. And the more you decrease it, the further to the left it's going to go. And you can go negative as well. I'm going to place mine at 4. Y is the same thing. Just the more you increase it, the further down it goes. And the more you decrease it, the further up it goes. So I'm going to place mine at 4 again. Blur is just going to be basically how much blurred it is. So if you increase it, it's going to look more and more faint, kind of blurred out. And if you decrease it to 0, it's just going to look like you have another rectangle behind it. So I'm going to leave it at 4. I think it was at 4 before. Spread is going to be basically if you want to increase distance across all dimensions. So up, down, left, and right. But I'm just going to leave it at 0. And then for the color, I'm going to click into here, use my eyedropper icon, and use this secondary color. So like so. It's going to be at an opacity of 100%, but you can decrease that. I'm going to put this all the way down to around 30, I think looks pretty good. And then I'm also going to click into my color picker again and kind of move around till I find a color that I kind of like. It's not going to show too much of a difference, but you maybe want it to be like a darker or lighter. Different ways you can just customize this. So basically now with this drop shadow effect, it makes it look like the card is like a little bit off of our page, right? This helps digital designs look a little bit more like real life. This one's a little bit just to show you stuff, but this is ways that you can create this illusion of depth in a design that is otherwise fully flat. So we have our project card and it's in a pretty good place. I'm actually just going to move this button down a little bit so it looks a little bit better, and maybe our title down a little bit. Even if you have a layout grid and you're placing things in your grid, it might just look a little weird when you take the grid out. And so sometimes you just go with your gut, go with what looks good to your eye. So now I have my project 1 group, which includes everything, my image, my masking, my title, and all of this stuff. Now, as you can probably tell from these 5 blank rectangle squares around here, we want to have some more projects on our site. We don't want to just show one project. That's the only thing we've ever done in our career. We probably want to show a couple. So we can easily do that. We could recreate it, right? We could go in here, change the color, change the stuff, but that's just adding so many times. So we can use what's called a component to make this easily reusable. So if you click on your project 1 group, if you don't have them grouped, just make sure that you have everything selected. And then up here where it says group, around where we had those Booleans, you'll notice that there's this diamond icon. And if you hover over it, it says create component. And if I click that, you'll notice that it turns purple, my kind of around the box. It turns purple over here in my layers as well. And this just basically means you have your component. And components allow you to easily update things across your design. So we're using this in a card way. Next week, we'll be doing more of a mobile app example for those of you who wanted to do that. You'll see a bunch of examples of that as well. And so what you can do with your components is go over to your assets tab. you'll see this under all libraries, there's this created in this file, and it says one component. So double click in there or click to get it, and you'll see our project one component. Now, to just create a version of that, you just click and drag, and you can add it all together. So you might be wondering, we already kind of did that though with other things. We like highlighted stuff and just duplicated it using our Alt or Option moves or Command and paste. Those are creating what are called like unlinked duplicates. This is going to be probably blowing your mind, I hope. I think it's cool. So I'm going to create a second one as well. Feel free to follow along if you would like. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit so just we can see both of these. So this is my main component right here. And these are my two instances. Whenever you drag your component from over here to over here, it creates an instance of that component. And basically what that means is it copies everything from your component and it keeps it linked. So now if I double click into my project one name and I start typing like Digital Lounge, it's going to update the text on all of those instances across my design. So really helpful if you're going to use something multiple times throughout your design and then you've designed it all and then you need to make a change near the end. Setting them up as components is pretty helpful. So I'm going to go back to project one name. Now we're going to have different components, right? Different instances. Maybe we don't want this one on the bottom to update when we update over here. Super simple to do it. You just make the changes over here. So instead of changing it in the component, you change it in the instance. So now I can type project two name, and I'm not going to see that anywhere else. This completely breaks that link between that component and the instance. So now if I go back up here and start typing Digital Lounge again, it's not going to update that instance where I made some specific change. It's only going to do the ones that you haven't made any change to. Now, maybe you made this change over here. We made a simple change of changing 1 to 2, but maybe you made some better change in your instance and you're like, you know what? I want that to be across everything. You can relink it if you go and select your instance up here. Over where there's that create component button, there's also this one right here called push changes to main component. And what this does is it takes what you changed in your instance and moves it to your main component, and then it'll move to all of those instances that remain linked. And so then you can go back and change stuff like this, and then it's linked again. So when you create your instances at first, they're linked fully. You make changes to your main component, it pushes to all of the linked instances. If you want to unlink something, just make the change in the specific instance. If you want to push your change from the instance to the main component, you use that push changes button up here. Next scenario is we have, let's say this one right here and this one right here. Now, if I wanted to like have my project 2 look different from my project 1 and my project 3 look different from my project 1, I still have to make all of those changes, right? And I have to make those a ton and they're locked in place, and then I have to move stuff around. So here's where components get really fun. So I'm going to delete my instances. I'm going to go back to my main component. And instead of that push changes to main, you'll see this other diamond icon. It's a diamond with a plus. You have to make sure you're on your main component if you still have your instances. This is adding what's called a variant, okay? So if I click add variant, one will get added right underneath, and we will see this over here. So I'm just gonna click onto my component group and drag it off. So it creates this as its like component group. I'm just gonna move it off of my design so it's a little bit easier to see, okay? So this is now a variant that we can make changes to. It's a different variation on this component. So for project 2, I want to change this to project 2 name is one of those changes. And I also want a different image. I want it to look distinct. My different projects probably look different. So I'm going to right click, go to plugins, unsplash, and I'm going to search for another. For me, I'm doing flowers. You can do whatever you want. And I'm going to pick this one, let's say. I'm just going to pick that, drag it over, and it's right there. Here's a neat little trick about masking. So if I go back to my file and I have my project 1 component, I can see my variant 2, which that's the variant that I chose. And I can see down here I have this mask group, right? So this is where that image is. If I just click and drag my image down in here, and it's here, and I can delete this image, that starting one, my other image is just in that masking group. So I don't have to go through the process of creating that mask group again. I can just add my image, click and drag in the layers panel to add it within my masking group, and then just delete the other image. Cool? All right. So now with your default one selected, so you should see project one, and then you should see default down here. Over here, you can see some settings that you can change to name stuff. So where it says property one, I'm just gonna put project number. Oop. And where it says default, I'm just gonna click in there 2 times and put 1. So this is just a naming mechanism, right? So now over here, I can see that I have project 1, and then I have my project 1. If I click on variant 2, I can see project number is my property, and I can just double click in there and change it to 2. Okay, so this is just naming my different variants about different properties. You can have a ton of different properties and a ton of different variants and components. Now, here's where I think it gets really fun and super simple. And this is this idea of things being portable, reusable, interchangeable. If I go back to my assets tab and I click and drag my project one component into my design again, and I place that where it is, you'll notice in the top right, under project one, I can see that project number property now, and I see the 1 is selected. If I click here and I change to 2, it's just going to switch to my variant. And so I can place it in my design and then just switch between the ones that I want to do without having to move stuff around. It's just a simple toggle of a setting. We will move on to our last topic briefly, and that is this concept of responsive design. So far we've been designing everything with a desktop kind of styling, making them good for this width, but we might want to resize our design to look good on an iPad. Maybe, this is a 1440 pixel width desktop. Maybe someone has like one of those huge monitors and you want to kind of design for one of those as well. You can change the size of your frame in Figma. So if you click on the home, you can either under layout change those sizes right here, or you can also click and drag to move your frame size to kind of see how it would react under different ones. You'll notice it doesn't look great as you change these. So we're going to play around with some settings, particularly with our heading where it says, "Hi, we're the Digital Lounge," so that as we go down, it's going to kind of wrap and do stuff. Okay. We're also going to do it where as we expand out, that our navigation menu at the top doesn't get so much white space on that right side. Okay. So we're going to start with the footer actually. So if you click on the footer, you'll notice I set this up. I forgot to undo this so that you get practice with doing this, but you'll get practice with another one. So up here is our constraints, right? So these are going to be our left and our bottom. And so if you go up to our one up here and click up here, it's left and top. Constraints are essentially just telling Figma, as our screen resizes, which dimension do we not want to change? So left and top for this top one is saying, hey, always keep the same amount of distance between the left side of our frame and the left side of our group and the top side of our group and the top side of the frame as we resize. So if I were to start moving to the right, it's not going to move up or down, and it's not moving to the left. If I change my left side though, it's going to keep that 50 pixel border, no matter how far to the left I move it. Same with the top. It's constrained to the top, so it's always going to be the same distance from the top. If I move it up, it's going to move up top with it. I set up the footer so that it's from the bottom. So if we move to the bottom, it's always going to be the same distance from the bottom, no matter how much we move it. As you're designing, if you design your footer first and you put it to the bottom, you can keep adding content, right? I could keep going and like add more sections to my homepage. I don't have to keep repositioning my footer, okay? So if we go up here and click on our group, for our navigation menu. You can change your constraints over here by either clicking on these buttons. Can get a little tricky by doing that. I recommend using these two right here. So you can choose for your horizontal, you can choose left, and right, or center, or scale. And then for your vertical, which is your top and your bottom, you can choose top and bottom, center, or scale. So if I were to switch this from left to right, for example, and I start resizing my screen, now getting that additions on my left side because I removed it from the left and I switched it to right. But now contact will always be, and the rest of my navigation menu will always be the same distance from the right side. What you can do, which is even cooler for this one, is switch it from right to left left and right. So you should see L plus R. If you double click into here for your grouping and change it to just right, then we should be good. There we go. So our whole group is set to left and right. So this is just making sure that the whole group kind of stays with the frame. But then when you double click within here to get our specific links, change it to just right. And then now if I move it from left to right, I'll get the same distance. My digital lounge thing wrapped because there wasn't enough space. And then over here on the right, it just adds space in between them. And I can keep going and keep going if I really wanted to. So they can be a little tricky to get started with, but that's one example. Okay, cool. So now let's work on this. So our text has this really interesting behavior where as we click here and we go like this, it starts clipping our content. We don't see that text anymore. So I click here and I can apply what is called an auto layout. So over here in the layout, there's this button that's like a long rectangle, a smaller square, and then a plus button. And this is called the Use Auto Layout. And when you click that, it essentially adds all of these controls for how you can lay out the objects in this group. So it's going to look at how we've already laid them out and give us some default behavior. If I switch from vertical layout, where things are on top, to our horizontal layout, it just moves our element left and right. So obviously probably not what we want for this. We also have wrap, and this will basically be like when it doesn't do too much, but this is like if we were to add more and more items, that it would wrap if there's space, if there's no longer space, I mean. So in this case, there wasn't space because if we were to switch to horizontal, you'll notice that this one keeps going over. So there isn't enough space for that element. So as we click wrap, it's going to automatically wrap that text underneath. If we were to add maybe like a short little text blurb over here and it could fit within this space, it's going to keep it there. But if there wasn't enough space to show all of its contents, it would wrap to the next line.
You were to just highlight and just wrap that.
No.
Box.
So I'm going to show you how we do that to do it with the whole box. And also this would wrap with it as well. Yeah, that's the next step. So with our box selected, over here, we have it set at a fixed width. You can also do hug contents. This will have some kind of weird behavior, if I'm being honest, as we do stuff. But this is just basically like put all of our contents together, and then its width is determined for this box is determined on how wide our contents are. Obviously, it doesn't look good in this scenario. So we want to switch it back to our fixed width, and it was at 1340 before. You can add minimum widths and maximum widths to say, hey, this is the biggest I want this box to be ever, or this is the smallest I want this box to be ever. We can also do the same stuff with our height over here. So we can make it a fixed height. We can hug the contents, which basically just means like, hey, if things are wrapping down more in the box, keep increasing the height to make sure that they can fit within our box. We can also put it at a fixed height so that no matter what, it doesn't go above or below that height. And then also you have your min and your max as well. So I'm going to switch this back to my down direction. So my horizontal layout. And then if you double click within here to select our text, change hug contents to fill container. And this is something that when you have individual elements, you can change these and it will be in relation to its group. So now when I put fill container, it's going to say, hey, my width of this text box matches the group box that I created. And double click into here and select this text box and change that same one to be a fill container. Now, as we have the group set to auto layout with down, our fixed width, and our hug height, if I double click in here, I can see that I have fill container for both of these. Another example of this, which you can see maybe more of these changes, is I'm just going to create my frame here. If I were to create some rectangles or some squares, I'm going to show you some settings. So I'm going to highlight all of these. I'm going to hit my auto layout and it automatically aligns them. So that makes them look a little bit better. And it creates them in our auto layout frame. With these middle, I can change the spacing in between each one. And by just clicking into one space and moving it, I can change the spacing between all of these elements. Right now, it's at our horizontal direction, but if I did vertical layout, it'll switch like so. I could also hit wrap, and then as I move my container frame to and from, it will do that. I think I might have just remembered what it was. Yep, okay. So in the group, I changed the constraints. Before it was only constrained to the left, which means that that distance between the left side of our group and the left side of that frame was the only thing that was remaining consistent. If I change it to left and right, now the right side is also constrained. So as I have that, our group is set to hug height, our fixed width, our individual elements are set to fill the container. As I click and drag to move our frame, that text starts to wrap, depending on our screen size. So you can imagine layout making this can get a little complicated. You'll always have to do some manual tweaking here and there. Like as we were to do this, for example, this looks like a jumbled mess. So you'd probably duplicate this all into a phone screen size and then make some manual adjustments and do stuff like that.